Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for this gift of an hour of your time this afternoon to hear a conversation about issues affecting veterans in the communities we live in. My name is Steve Abdow. I'm the director of Human to Human, a collaboration of good works begun by the Episcopal Diocese of Western Massachusetts, focused on the humanitarian work of the church. Works such as the Building Bridges Veterans Initiative, which produced this forum today. And for those of you who don't know about Building Bridges, I want to give you a little background. Building Bridges is a non-sectarian initiative founded to create community among American veterans, address veteran isolation, and express a culture-wide appreciation for the service veterans have rendered on behalf of us all. Launched 5 years ago as a single site at the World War II Club in Northampton, Massachusetts, the initiative has grown to 9 sites with almost half the communities convening weekly and the other half monthly. As the movement has grown, so has the demand, with veterans service officers, veterans organizations, churches, and fraternal organizations increasingly expressing interest in creating sites in their own cities and towns. And depending on a variety of factors, the Building Bridges communities draw from between 30 veterans per month to more than 100 per week. The communities are designed to be simple and volunteer run, providing a hot, hearty meal, a comfortable, welcoming space in which to converse, and when desirable, a venue where members can avail themselves to VA services, veteran nonprofit resources, and light programming. Due to its simplicity and efficacy, we believe Building Bridges to be reproducible and sustainable. We had to discontinue our lunches last year, and over the winter, we have been holding monthly drive-through lunches in 3 locations while we wait for the right time to reconvene. In the meantime, we thought to take advantage of the convenience of video conferencing to produce this public conversation with a few key champions and allies of the initiative to explore some of the things we are all learning about the veterans' experience. With that, I would like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon's forum. The Reverend Chris Carlisle is Director of Building Bridges. Having spent 25 years in campus ministry, Chris is now dedicated to veterans ministry initiatives, outdoor Christian communities, and the innovation of new expressions of church in the Commonwealth. He's passionate about this work and has been a terrific partner. Chris, I hand it to you.
Thank you, Steve. And welcome everybody to what I believe will be a truly stimulating discussion about the American veteran experience, as well as its relevance to our life together as a nation, and the church's response or responses to meeting the needs of our veterans in pursuit of a healthy society for all of us. So, introducing our panel, we are privileged to have with us retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Jim Parity, the Right Reverend Douglas Fisher, Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Western Massachusetts, and the Right Reverend Alan Gates, Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts. Lieutenant Colonel Paradis has held numerous posts in his military career, including Missile Launch Officer, Public Affairs Officer and Director of Media Relations, Combat Camera and Information Operations during several deployments, including Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. After his military service, he worked for the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs and led outreach efforts to assist veterans with their benefits throughout Southern New England. A former newspaper reporter and longtime writer, he is today a columnist for the Daily Hampshire Gazette and lives in Florence, Massachusetts. Prior to becoming Bishop of Western Massachusetts, Doug Fisher was rector of Grace Episcopal Church, Millbrook, New York, and perhaps most germane to this discussion, rector of the Church of the Holy Innocents in Highland Falls, outside the gate of the U.S. Military Academy, where he served as a West Point chaplain. It was Bishop Fisher who, from the beginning of his episcopate, mandated a ministry to address the needs of U.S. veterans, which ultimately took the form of building bridges. Bishop Allen Gates is a native son born in Springfield, who served in the Diocese of Western Massachusetts before migrating to the Midwest. We got him back to the state in 2014 when he was elected Bishop of Massachusetts in the eastern part of the state. Prior to seminary, Bishop Gates was a Russian language translator, researcher, and intelligence analyst for the U.S. Department of Defense, including on a tour of duty at the State Department. It is hoped that Building Bridges' first expansion beyond the Diocese of Western Massachusetts is to the Diocese of Massachusetts. Gentlemen, thank you for your presence and participation. As a rough roadmap, the conversation will begin with a chance for each of you to describe your relationship to the veteran experience in all its diversity, perhaps imparting some of your personal background in this regard. I will then ask you to respond to a quote from anthropologist Sebastian Junger's book, Tribe, in which Junger looks at post-traumatic stress in a very unconventional way. And we will end with how you envision our society might become healthier with regard to our relationship to veterans, and in the process, become healthier as a nation. So beginning with Lieutenant Colonel Parity. John, tell us something about your relationship to the experience of veterans, the most critical issues you feel should be addressed, and what you believe to be the greatest challenges in effectively addressing the difficulties facing veterans when they return home.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for the introduction, and welcome everyone. It's great to be with you this afternoon. Perhaps if you could put up the first slide there, first picture image. And what I'd like to do is share with you some photos that are particularly meaningful to me, a photo album of sorts, and that I hope shares some insight into our veteran experience, and that the words homecoming and belonging mean, and what it means truly about our shared humanity as military members, veterans, and civilians. So I've been around veterans and military service my entire life. At a very young age, my father, a veteran of the Second World War and the Korean War, would take me with him when we'd go to VA hospitals, and we'd be visiting veterans and we'd be visiting family members. My parents are from Maine, and it was very important for my father in particular that I learned about American history and those who served our country. And he would tell me about different veterans from Maine and from all over New England. So I learned at a very young age about soldiers and military leaders like Joshua Chamberlain. And he took me to Gettysburg National Military Park to see Little Round Top and learn about the 20th Maine Infantry. So what you see here is one of the most profound images that my father showed me when I was young. He showed it to me first in a book, and then later I'd go down to see it at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It's the painting, The Veteran in a New Field by Winslow Homer, who, while wasn't a veteran himself, he did cover the Civil War as an illustrator for the very popular Harper's Weekly. So what you see here in this painting is a veteran from the Civil War who returns home to his farm in rural Maine. He has set aside his uniform jacket and the canteen that you could see in the bottom right corner there. And he's returning to normal life. It's a new field for him after he's been fighting in war. And the scythe, the blade with the long handle, it is said may be a reminder of the Grim Reaper and death that he observed so closely in war. And the field of wheat represents hope, the renewal of life, grain, the symbol of rebirth and recovery. And Homer completed this painting just months after the assassination of President Lincoln, at a time when our nation was in great mourning. So I start with this painting to note that the veteran experience when returning home from war has been chronicled in literature and the humanities for centuries. Next image, please. So my father served in the Navy at the end of the Second World War and then through the Korean War. Here he is with his shipmates. A Corsair, the Navy fighter aircraft, is behind them. He's the guy second from the left. And he's got his arm around his buddy. And, note the smiles in their faces. This photo to me just shows the esprit de corps, the pride and fellowship they have. And it's just a wonderful photo that is a great keepsake in our family. Next image. So in this photo, my dad, this time the fresh-faced young man there, boy, really, second from the right, sharing some Cokes. Now, I have a lot of pictures of my dad from his time in the service, but the last one I showed you and this one tell me a story that is common for us as veterans, and one that I've heard so often throughout my life and with my experience as a veteran outreach coordinator and as a veteran advocate, and that's one of belonging. You see my dad here after he returned home to Maine after the Korean War. He went to college, he became a school teacher, and he raised us as kids and he raised a family, and he had a very successful teaching career for 25 plus years, and he was very active in his community and in his church. But yet to this day, and I talk to my father nearly every day, he's in his mid-90s now, and he's doing quite well at an assisted living facility in Florida, is that he talks about his time in the Navy. And I mean all the time. It was the seminal moment in his life and what truly defines him. He doesn't talk about the hardships, he doesn't talk about losing men at war, about enduring typhoons and great storms at sea. I've come to find out about those things over time, but it was the camaraderie with his buddies and the purpose, the authenticity, the connectedness that he had then that has most meaning to him, and one I believe he's longed to always have throughout his entire life. Next image there. Yes, so that's the top left there, the second row, is my uncle Jim Parity. He was a pilot in the Second World War, and he flew several combat missions and later became a test pilot for the Air Force. He was at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. He died in 2019 at the VA hospital in Togus, Maine, and I miss him every day. I think about him every day. He became a pilot and an Air Force officer, by the way, without a high school diploma. He first joined the Army before the war because there was nothing for him back in rural Maine during the Great Depression, and he quickly rose through the ranks and made officer. And that's my Uncle Jim. So my father and uncle grew up in rural Maine during the Great Depression. They were from a family of 7. My dad was the youngest, and he looked up to his big brother Jim. They and all their siblings were split up when my dad was a toddler because his mom and dad couldn't provide for all of them. They had a tough, hard life. And I say this to you because hardship and suffering is not just an experience unique to soldiers. Certainly, as our nation looks at 500,000 deaths to COVID-19, a number that exceeds all the American military deaths in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined, that tells us that. So what you're looking at here is an image of the underground during the Blitz in London. This was taken on October 16th, 1940. October 1940 was the worst month during the Blitz. Just 2 days before the heaviest night attack to date had occurred, some 380 German bombers had devastated London, killing 200 civilians and 2,000 injured. And as the raids continued day after day, night after night, folks would come down into the underground like this. But yet note the closeness of these Brits, the smiles on their faces, all this despite knowing that they might not even survive the night. So Sebastian Junger in his book describes this phenomenon. He points out several times with many examples throughout history, and he references research that shows that time after time, when people are actively engaged in a cause, their lives have more purpose, with a resulting improvement in mental health, that people will feel better psychologically if they have more involvement with their community, and that goes to our military members when we return home, and that our readjustment is far better with support and understanding from our communities. Next image. So a little bit about me. That's me there in Afghanistan. For most of my military career, I was a press officer. And I was responsible for getting the story out, getting the story of our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen and Marines told to an American audience back home. My job when deployed was to assign combat camera teams or military journalists to get the story, or like in this image, to personally take reporters downrange to see the fighting and our troops in action. This photo was taken from Forward Operating Base Bromel on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Next image. I never stayed in place for too long. I'd jump on a Chinook or a Black Hawk. I'd go to a hot spot for a few days here, a week then somewhere else, then back in my hooch in my rear echelon headquarters for a bit before going out again. I did that for several months, but I didn't have it anywhere close to what our soldiers had to endure on a daily basis. And I want to make that clear to everyone. But I do want to say and emphasize that whether I was in places like Bosnia, Iraq, or Afghanistan, I came away with a great admiration and respect and in total awe of what our troops do to survive and endure and get the mission accomplished when in harm's way. So what you're seeing here is a combat camera image from one of our troops that they took of soldiers manning the mortars, firing off thousands of rounds in a Bromel district at a remote outpost that literally would come under attack every single day and night. Now, Younger wrote about such soldiers in his book Tribe and in his book War. His writing became the basis for the award-winning film Restrepo that some have described as the best and most realistic portrayal of what soldiers experience in war. Next image. Now here's a combat camera picture of Army Captain Jason R. Dye. He was at the time the company commander for Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 87th Infantry Regiment. Here he is, he's checking for enemy infiltrators along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border near Bromel after his company had just set fire to several Taliban shelters. For Captain Dye and his soldiers, their deployments away from home for more than a year to 15 months was an endless, body-numbing anticipation of battle with automatic risks taken in combat to protect their brothers, an adrenaline-fueled and often confusing dynamic in facing down mortal danger. Next image. Now, the images that are seared in my memory and have caused me many a sleepless night are ones like this. In my 20 years of military service, I've seen some of the worst in humanity, but the ones that have really hit me down to my very soul and are still hard for me to still comprehend is the plight of children in a vast majority of our planet. Now, this is actually one of the more benign images, if you will, a young girl in Afghanistan greeting an American soldier. I can't begin to tell you other things I've seen up close: the abject poverty, malnutrition, violence, disability, disfigurements, lack of good health care and education with children. I'll say, life is cheap in many, many parts of our world. And American service members oftentimes can see this on a regular basis. And when you yourself are a mother or father, as a parent, it can really tear you up inside. And I can tell you that it did tear me up. Next image. This is Sergeant First Class Meredith Howard. So she was the oldest female casualty of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. She was a firefighter when her unit was called up. She was assigned to a civil affairs battalion. And this picture on the left was taken in 2006 and shows her giving a school bag to a young Afghan girl. Establishing schools for Afghan girls was a big part of the civil affairs mission. On September 7th of 2006, she and other soldiers in her battalion had dinner with us and her fellow Army reservists that she knew in our military public affairs detachment that was assigned to us. That was her last supper. The next morning, Friday, September 8th, I was meeting with her at the US Embassy to get an update on their civil affairs mission. And as she and the soldiers with her were leaving the embassy in Kabul to return back to her operating base, the Humvee she was riding in was struck by a vehicle bomb that was planted and then detonated at the exact time her vehicle entered a busy intersection called Masood Circle in Kabul. I saw it happen. The carnage was everywhere, and she died along with Army Staff Sergeant Robert Paul that morning. And I think of her every day as well. Next image. When I returned home, it was a homecoming with my kids, my wife. I was able to sleep in my own bed, get a home-cooked meal. I thought I was the same man, but there were things I didn't even notice were happening, only things that my family observed, but they knew I wasn't the same person. I now know about terms like avoidance and hypervigilance, among other things that many of us are all too now familiar with. And I would find myself in mood swings, sometimes tearing up, other times getting angry, all at things I otherwise would have just smiled at or perhaps not even noticed at all. So one afternoon in 2009, after I had retired from the Air Force, and my wife and I moved back home to New England, we thought we'd take our kids to the local Friendly restaurant in Florence. And so Friendly's, right? Everybody, has had that experience. I grew up like many of us going to Friendly's, a place I had told my kids about so many times before when we were living in other places across the country and overseas. So, let's all go get a sundae and a fribble and have a nice night. But in the booth next to ours was a young boy. My guess, he was probably 4 or 5, and he was acting up. He was just clowning around. He was having fun. And like this girl in this photo, he was tapping me on the shoulder and he was making faces at me. And he was just being a kid. But in that moment, it took me to some faraway places. It took me to the streets of Kabul or to Sarajevo or to Baghdad or to Liberia or to beggars on the streets. One particular boy I remember badly maimed with lice on the streets of Tirana, Albania, crying for help every day I would see him. And so, in that moment, in that packed Friendly's restaurant in Western Massachusetts, I lost it. I had a complete meltdown. My kids had never seen me like that. It's my observation, one that Younger talks about so profoundly in his books, and that's what's difficult is for us to readjust as veterans, is that when we return to a society where our fellow citizens often take for granted the wealth that we have and the basic necessities in life, and we return back to our homes and we see that it's oftentimes, the rat race and people are, having arguments and disagreements. It all runs counter to what we experienced in service. And as Younger says, after our military service, it's often hard to know how to live in a country that regularly tears itself apart. Next image. So this is the last photo I'd like to share with you. I truly appreciate having this audience in this time with you. I recognize that there are many veterans who are with us this afternoon, and you're all my brothers and sisters, and I mean that, bless all of you. It's truly hard to summarize all of our collective experiences. Each of us has a unique story to tell, and I encourage each of you to tell it. Believe me, it does help. It helps in the healing process. And remember that what is central to our service and one that binds us all together is the oath that we took to defend our nation. So this is a portrait of Heather Penny, an Air Force pilot on September 11, 2001, 9/11, as she looks down at that horrific scene that day at the Pentagon. She and her wingman, Mark Sasseville, had no idea that morning what they would be called to do in duty to our nation. She was given the mission to interdict United Flight 93 and bring it down by any means possible before it crashed into the Capitol as it was en route from the skies of Pennsylvania, making its way into Washington, D.C. There was no time to arm the F-16s with missiles, and all she had was enough ammo for a 5-second burst. She would have to ram her F-16 and sacrifice herself and die in order to take down that aircraft. And as we now know, the passengers on board, with those words from Todd Beamer, "Let's roll," attempted to regain the aircraft, which ultimately crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, saving that aircraft from hitting its intended target, the Capitol. All true citizen heroes. But Lieutenant Penny was prepared that day to give up her own life. And later she said the following: "There are things in this world that are more important than ourselves. We belong to something greater than ourselves. As complex and diverse and discordant as it is, this idea called America binds us together in citizenship and community and brotherhood." And as all of us know, our nation has the greatest military in the world. It's been said, and I've heard more often this sentiment of late, that the only country capable of destroying us might be our dear nation herself. In my view, we're one big community, one big tribe, And when deployed, we know we take care of one another. So as a nation, we need to do that. We need to take care of one another. And we need to have shared humanity. And just as all of us in service have shown when we're deployed and serving our country, we can take care of one another. And I hope that that's my hope for all of us as American citizens. Thank you. Thank you for letting me share my journey this afternoon. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, John, so much. Very moving. Doug.
Well, thank you, John, for that powerful story. And I want to thank Chris and Steve for their dedication to building bridges. We've done a lot of work for this. And I want to thank my brother, Bishop Allen, for taking on the veterans, this Building Bridges program in the Diocese of Massachusetts. So I'm really grateful for him. So my connection with veterans goes to when I was the rector of Holy Innocents Church in Highland Falls, New York, which in the church itself is right outside their gate. And after I was there for all of 1 week, the Episcopal chaplain at West Point actually got assigned to Germany. And there wasn't a chaplain to take his place in the military. There's not a lot of Episcopal priests in the military at this point. And so Barney Forsyth came over and with several others interviewed me and asked me if I'd be the Episcopal chaplain at West Point. And I said yes, and it was a decision that really changed me in a whole lot of different ways. The one caveat I put to it, though, is I said, I'll come to West Point for all kinds of things, but I'd like the cadets and the faculty and others to come to Holy Innocents Church on Sunday mornings. And they agreed to do that. And that also was a real game changer because there's a lot of town gown tension that had gone back 200 years. And I think that moves kind of helped alleviate some of that. The other thing was that the cadets loved it being at Holy Innocents. And think about this, when you go to college is a very, very different experience, right? You go to West Point, it's a really different experience. And they loved coming to Holy Innocents because they said, this feels like home. You know, there's little kids, there's elderly people. We do what we did at our churches back home. This feels like home. So it really kind of rooted them, which was wonderful. And it was a great experience for my family. Betsy and I had 3 young children at that point, and they just really got engaged with the cadets and just really loved being with them. When my son Jeff, at his 8th birthday, someone said to him, "What was your best memory of the last year?" And he said, "It was the rally for the Army-Navy game. That was the best day all year." And another person asked my daughter Kara, who's the oldest, she was about 9 years old at that point. She said, "Kara, do you like being at West Point?" And she said, "Oh, yes. Everyone there is so ironed." Being a 9-year-old in a family with 3 children, a lot of chaos, being ironed was very important to her. So that was all great. In addition, we had Canterbury Club every Tuesday night. And in Canterbury Club, people were really encouraged to not only live their faith and practice their faith, but to really think about their faith, to really think about what they believe and why they believe it. Those nights were filled with really great discussion, really honest wrestling with the faith, looking at the scriptures, seeing what it means in our time. Again, a real gift. Another thing that West Point did for me was it tore apart any kind of stereotypes I had about people in the military. I would have naively thought that they all thought the same way, they all had the same motivation. And that wasn't true at all. Everyone had their own unique personality. Everyone had different motivations for why they were at West Point. And I really found out a lot about those motivations when it would come near the end of the 2nd year for cadets. Because up until the end of your 2nd year, you can drop out of West Point with no obligation to the military, with no need to pay back your tuition. But if you decide to go beyond your 2nd year, and if you were to drop out in your 3rd or 4th year, you'd still owe the Army 5 years, and there'd be financial issues too. So what that led to would be a lot of cadets who'd come to me to say, before the end of the 2nd year, should I keep on going? Should I keep on going? And they were great discussions where people, again, looked at their own motivation, either recommitted to that, or they found another motivation, or they said, I'm really not called to that. But it gave me a great insight into the struggles of these young people, the decisions they have to make at a young age, and the courage it takes to do that. Even though they're all so different in personality, one thing that was really common was their desire and willingness to serve. That was always really clear. It was said just before by John that Pilate, that there's something greater than us, and a call for the common good. And they all had a feeling about something greater than us and a call to the common good. And so one example of many that I could give about that call to serve was one day I was out at Camp Buckner while Beast Barracks was going on, which is what the plebes do in their first summer. It's also called Cadet Basic Training. And they were running this obstacle course. And at this one point in the obstacle course, this one plebe, young cadet, just started to, he looked like he was about to faint. He just started to sway. And other cadets who were behind him got right behind him, put him on each shoulder, and kept on going. And there was a couple of things that were significant about that. One was that if you didn't run the course under a certain time, you'd have to run it again. So here they were taking on this other cadet. There were no way they were going to meet the time. They were going to have to run the course over again. But the other thing that interested me is that they didn't stop to ask him why he was fainting. I mean, it could have been for some unknown physical reason that he didn't know yet. But it could have been that he had 5 donuts for breakfast that morning. It could have been that they were supposed to do all kinds of physical training to get ready for West Point. And maybe in his high school senior year, he didn't do that. They didn't ask him. They just helped him. Real call to service, real call to the common good. Another dimension of call to service is all kinds of faculty members who would come to West Point at whatever time of the year, and they would come to church. Unlike a lot of other folks who might like check out the church for a while, and maybe after you're there for 6, 7, 8 months, you might say, you know, I think I'll sign up for this committee or that committee. They would come in and immediately say, how can I be helpful here? Immediately, no matter what it was. You know, yeah, we've got the Shrove Tuesday pancake dinner tomorrow night. Yeah, I'll run that. You know, there's this right away, not only looking at community, but engaging community immediately. You know, from there, after I left West Point, then it's the 2000s and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars happened. And a lot of cadets would contact me, email me with their experience. And there were some tough experiences, but they, again, entered it with tremendous courage and with tremendous creativity. I remember one former cadet who was at this point a captain writing to me, you know, say, I've been trained to jump out of planes and shoot a gun. And he said, right now, we just took over this city, and I'm now functionally the mayor of a city of 50,000 people that have no water and no electricity. And he's got to use all the inner resources he's got to do that. I've got another cadet who he actually transferred from the Army to the Marines because he wanted to be a Marine pilot. And his job the last few years has been to spot piracy off the African coast and go down and land helicopters near on the boat and get the pirates off. so work he never probably would have ever thought he was doing, but really, really necessary work. And then, you know, after I left Millbrook and I was ordained a bishop, my first choice to preach at my ordination was General Barney Forsyth, who was the academic dean at West Point when I was there. And he is just someone who really gets the gospel. I knew he was the one I wanted to preach. So those are some of my connections to veterans. And I think the last part of your question, Chris, was what are the problems that I might see in terms of people going from the military into civilian life? And some I can see are identity, community, and purpose. That all kinds of gets rethought. In the identity one, I can really identify with, because when we're young men and women, sometimes we take on an identity by taking on a career, a job that involves a uniform, because the uniform tells you who you are, right? So as a young priest, 25 years old, I took on the uniform. So the uniform of being a priest really gave me my identity. So I can see how the uniform helps with the identity, and then when you take the uniform, when you leave the uniform, what's your new identity, and how to reshape that, and how to reshape that with God's grace. So thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you, Doug. Great. Alan.
Hi, thanks, Chris. Hello, everyone. It's really a great honor for me to be here with you all, and especially with John and Doug. So I need to say, first of all, I'm not a veteran, and I lay no claim to direct insights into that experience. And I think part of the way that I honor your experience is by acknowledging all that I don't know about your experience. My grandfather was a chaplain at the Bedford VA hospital. He himself was a World War I vet, and he came back from the war, and he went to seminary, became a small town pastor, and all through the Depression and World War II, he served this particular church. And then as soon as World War II was done, because of his experience as a vet from World War I, he knew what he wanted to do, which was to leave the congregation and go to the Bedford VA and serve the vets that were coming home from there. And then my mom was a psychiatric nurse at that same Bedford VA hospital. And my dad was a Navy vet from the end of World War II. He trained at Great Lakes Naval Base, and then he shipped out from San Diego on the USS Currituck. It was a seaplane tender. And he shipped out from San Diego on August 4th, 1945, in the Pacific Arena and Theater. So the date tells you what you need to know, which is that 4 days later, as the Currituck was sailing towards that theater, the bomb was dropped and the war ended. So he never saw active combat, but he did see the aftermath of it, which he didn't talk about a lot. So I had this kind of family history, but for myself, the point of intersection in my life with some of the dynamics that you all face as veterans has been conditioned, especially in my young adult years, when after college, as Chris mentioned in the introduction, before I decided to go to seminary, I was working as a Russian linguist, and I was a civilian employee of the Department of Defense. Most of that time I was at Fort Meade, Maryland, for a little while down at Foggy Bottom, but mostly at Fort Meade, mostly in naval offices. So I was working alongside of both active duty and retired naval officers, as well as some other civilians. And this experience instilled in me just a very, very deep admiration and respect for those who devote their lives to military service or have had a significant portion of it in that dedication. But then another, I think, point of intersection for me experientially with what at least some veterans tell me that they've experienced happened for me when I left my government service and working at DOD and went off to seminary in Boston. And what happened was, this was 1984. So this is, a little over a decade after Vietnam, but still very much in that active kind of post-Vietnam era in the American culture. So when I arrived at seminary, what I hadn't thought about encountering, but encountered right away, was a really significant level of suspicion and hostility from many of my seminary classmates who in that particular era, in that post-Vietnam era, had all kinds of what I would consider to be simplistic sets of assumptions about values and ethos of those who had served in the military, or in my case, as a DoD employee. So armed with their simplistic assumptions and projections, I found myself, well, encountering folks who assumed that they knew all they needed to know about me and my politics and my values and my ethos by this one dimension of my life. And that was a very challenging experience that I hear from a lot of veterans that they encounter. Folks who assume that they know everything they need to know about you from that piece of your identity. And so, you know, I grew past that in the seminary community with time, by virtue of what? By virtue of our life together, right? By virtue of being alongside of those folks in community, studying together, praying together, and maybe most notably sharing meals together. We had meals in the refectory together, and you know, it was in those places where we got to know each other and they got to know me, past those kind of single issue stereotypes that people can so easily use by way of projecting. So the takeaways for me from that experience were the importance of you know, watching out and guarding against projections and assumptions and stereotypes, and also having an understanding and a compassion for others who are receiving that, including vets in our culture. Secondly, the importance of companionship. There was one other seminarian, his name was Eston Collins, and he'd been active duty Army before he came to seminary. And he and I had a dish room shift together, you know, so we'd be washing the dishes and sharing, and both are being able to articulate what we were feeling sort of projected on us from the community around us. That kind of companionship with somebody else who kind of gets from the inside what you're experiencing was really important. And then thirdly, just coming together in community as the way that we get beyond those places of isolation and separation in our lives. And that, of course, brings us to building bridges. So let me stop, because I know Chris has a couple of other things that he wants to be sure and ask, but those are some points of intersection in my story.
Thank you, Bishop. It's actually a great segue, because one of the missionary sort of dimensions of building bridges is breaking down those stereotypes. And as somebody who is not a veteran, I can't. There have been few experiences in my ministry that have been richer than suddenly delving into the world of veterans and having so many perceptions broken apart, and being graced by the kind of fellowship, collegiality, and generosity of spirit that that I've known in building bridges. So that's a wonderful segue. So let us move to Sebastian Junger's quote that I mentioned earlier. And I think what we can do is respond to that quote, and at the same time, since we're a little short on time, have each of the panelists think about the quote relative to next steps that that we might take within the veteran network, within the church, in civilian society. In his book, Tribe, anthropologist Sebastian Junger says this: statistics show that about half the US military has applied for some form of disability based on post-traumatic stress. Yet only about 10% of veterans have been engaged in any form of combat, which means that 40% really weren't traumatized, but come home feeling deeply alienated and out of place. The only language they have for it is post-traumatic stress. I actually don't think that's what it is. And by definition, it can't be. What they're experiencing is the very real trauma of reintegration into modern society. And Younger goes on to say, and so I had this idea. Maybe the rate of long-term trauma that combatants experience is a function not of what happens on the battlefield, but of the kind of society they come home to. If you come home to a cohesive tribal society, maybe you recover quite quickly from trauma. So I'd like to ask each one of you to respond to this quote and then perhaps end by talking about what you see to be the most critical next steps to health and wholeness. John.
Yeah, Chris. So, I think that's a central theme in Sebastian Junger's book. And it really, to me, comes down to the alienation that we often sometimes feel that regardless of what branch or where you served, firstly, I must say, I mean, post-traumatic stress is real. The things that we go through, the flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, numbness, sleep disorders, all that. And it can be very difficult, and there's support and there's treatment. And certainly we want to encourage everyone. I think also the commonality is that we have seen, certainly in this past year, many walks of life that have experienced great trauma in our nation, first responders, healthcare providers, et cetera, and that have been exposed to significant trauma in their livelihood. I think what Younger touches upon, though, is that civil military divide in our nation where we come home after witnessing the things that we've seen and the camaraderie and the cohesiveness, and we're all part of this team, and we come back to a culture that really values a lot of extrinsic values, whether it's money or power or status, or there's that great division that we're seeing in our country. It reminds me of a quote. There's a book called Tough as They Come written by Staff Sergeant Travis Mills, who was wounded he was one of only 5 that survived quadruple amputee injuries. And his book at the end talks about resilience. And his wife says this. His wife says, they say that something like 90% of marriages that go through a tragedy, such as what they experience as a couple, don't make it. But with us, it's brought us closer. It's made us stronger. We don't fight about stupid things that normal people get divorced over. Who takes the trash out? Who cares? We never fight about petty things anymore. We don't take life for granted anymore. We've started a new life now, and we're all together, and that's all that matters. And I think that's, to me, that what it comes down to, the very essence of it, how I start, how I'm grounded each and every day. Focus on the things that are truly important in our lives and take care of one another as good neighbors, just as we were taught, as we went through, our own church teachings. And I think if we all could do that, we'd be a much better nation. So that's what I hope. And that's why I believe building bridges is so powerful, because at the end of the day, it's just us getting together and talking with one another. And we've seen that in so many examples that when people sit down and talk, you can solve a lot of things, and we're much better for it. So that's, yeah.
Thank you, John. Doug.
Well, I would recommend Junger's book, which has also been a controversial book in a lot of quarters. But I think what he does is he leaves us with exactly the question you give us, Chris, is what, how to address these issues of belonging and community, and collaboration, and as opposed to, as one of the reviewers of his book put, that they come home to a country where politicians and others are just screaming at each other all the time. So what are the ways we can do that? So I want to build on what John said. I think building bridges is a great place where people can gather, they can tell their stories, and we can ask them what would be most helpful to them. It's been a big part of your work, Chris, is you've asked people what's helpful. So thank you for doing that. Another dimension of it, I think, is that I've read that 43% of the armed forces are people of color. And another issue in our country, of course, we have is the issue of racism. And so they leave the armed forces and go into a country that is really struggling with racial justice and really coming to terms with white supremacy. And so I think one of the things we can do for our returning vets is to take this moment in time very much to heart and address the inequality of our country that's been existing for 400 years in a really deep way. Another part too, I think, is when I look back at my West Point experience, is that West Point alumni are really close. You know, when people leave the Army after they've been in West Point, they've got lots of contacts, lots of people who can introduce them to people and help them find jobs and help them acclimate to the culture that they're in. What would happen if we had a veterans alumni? Maybe building bridges can be part of that, so that veterans can contact one another. They can give one another leads and help with jobs and help with different issues, and to have a veterans alumni. Maybe building bridges is part of that.
Thank you. Alan.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think Younger points to, and who knows what the statistics are, but what he's saying is that for many veterans, he says 40%, the issue is not actually trauma so much as alienation, as he calls it, or disorientation, dislocation, isolation. And these features, disorientation, dislocation, isolation, these are shared profoundly by a lot of folks in our society, and I think increasingly so. And so, I think one part of the work that Building Bridges, I think, can help us do is push back against the extraordinary kind of binary thinking that so permeates our culture. I mean, and partly it relates back to my story about, landing at seminary where everybody had assumptions, but because the binary assumption was, good or bad, right? Conservative or liberal, peace-loving or warmongering. I mean, these false binary categories. And so, for veterans, occasionally I've had conversations where how I would paraphrase it is the binary is hero or villain. And you may not feel that you're a hero, but you sure don't want to be portrayed as a villain, right? Because you're not. And so pushing back against that kind of binary thinking, and of course that relates to Doug's comments about the connection with racism as well, is one piece. But then the whole, what I commented on about what got me through and beyond that experience of isolation of my own was the building of community. It's sort of obvious, but yet in our culture these days, there's so much that's pushing against the maintaining of community, right? My ministry in small town Western Mass, specifically as regards veterans, right, had all these places where the veterans had community. There were specifically the VFW posts and American Legion posts, but also there were all kinds of annual public events, and even the Veterans Park right in the middle of Ware, and the Friendlies next door. John mentioned Friendlies. I wonder if Friendlies has a particular connection, right, to the mission of giving a safe place for veterans, which now that Friendlies has fixed its bankruptcy, maybe that's an issue. But my point is simply churches stepping into the void of the increasing void of places that facilitate and create the kinds of community that can push against all the isolating features of our of our society, whether it's political divisions, that's divisive, right? Social media predominance can be isolating. Technology, people are working online, can be isolating. COVID is isolating. Economic stratification is isolating. So we have all these isolating features of our lives, which land on veterans very heavily, as well as others. And against that, and to mitigate that, the churches have to step into their foundational role of community. I'll end with this, but folks in Eastern Mass are used to hearing my soapbox about the word religion. So as a former linguist, it's intriguing and significant to me. The middle syllable lig, L-I-G. So the word comes from Latin, and it's the same root lig that you see in a word like ligament or a ligature, right? And it's a connective tissue. And so the actual very meaning of the word religion is reconnection. And so if we step up to our vocation, it's about connecting and reconnecting people. And when people say, oh, religion's bad because of all the ways that it divides people, well, then it's actually not religion. Because by definition, religion can't be dividing people, or it's false religion, right? So if building bridges can be one of the ways that we can step into that location of connection and reconnection, then I think we'll be living up to really significant vocation that we have.
Thank you, Alan. Let me give you an opportunity, if you'd like to respond one last time, because one of the things that I think brings us from what Alan said all the way back to the beginning is what John had to say about having his Last Supper with the sergeant. And in another context, I think John really sort of spoke to the power of building bridges as the power of breaking bread at a table, at a common table, which is, after all, the central focus finally of Eucharistic Church. That is the fundamental, not only ritual but reality. And so I guess I would ask also, particularly the bishops, but maybe beginning with John, what you imagine that dynamic of breaking bread to what do you imagine that to do about the future of the church? In other words, one of the things that struck me, John, when you talked about that Last Supper, which was not in a church sanctuary, but it was probably in a simple dining room, that out of that room experience, which is certainly described in the Gospels, in the upper room where Jesus is with the disciples, what we normally sort of have made into a sort of religious act. And I don't mean that in the way that you talked about it, Alan, but I mean, it's perceived as sort of something that one undertakes if you belong. And what I have experienced about building bridges is that Eucharist happens every time the community gathers together. It doesn't have to be named that. It is simply present in the way that Jesus's Last Supper was really the embodiment of God's Holy Spirit. So I don't know. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's a way in which one could argue that an initiative like building bridges is also turning around and helping the church to change and open up and incarnate its original mission of 2,000 years ago. So John, do you want to just say something about that again as a sort of way to close, and then we'll ask whether the bishop would like to just make one last comment?
Absolutely, Chris. There's a comment in the chat here from, and I can't read the person's name here right now at the moment, but she says, I like the concept of building bridges and that veterans can just come and be without the expectations of other types of veteran organizations and the formality with all that. And I think that is so true. What I have seen, firsthand is you're just coming together as a community. It's everything that that Doug and Alan have described, the connectedness and why that's so important, why it's so vitally important at this time in our lives, in our nation, that sense of community, that sense of belonging. And I think what's so central, to us as veterans, and for really, truly for anyone who has had, the ability to serve, and that's really all of us can serve our communities and serve and be good neighbors. That, this is a time when just getting together to share a meal is, to me, can be a sacred moment. To not, take for granted that you have this opportunity to sit down and share a meal and to have a conversation, because all of us know that, life is a fleeting moment. And for those of us that have been in harm's way and have seen firsthand, that every day truly is a bonus, and every day is a gift from God, that one to share and embrace. I think that to me is the power in just something as simple as just getting together, whether it's weekly or monthly, whatever the community can do to bring people together to talk. And the other thing, Chris, you had mentioned, and I've seen it too, is when we've had those storyteller moments, that is significant. I think, veterans, all of us, we just want to be heard, want to be able to tell our story. And I think that also is an important part to healing and making the connection with our communities and with the people in our neighborhoods. So it's wonderful what you're doing. It's significant.
Thank you, John. Doug or Alan? Any last thoughts?
Sure. Well, I was interested in John's story too about the meal that he remembers. And, in our Christian tradition, the meal is also a memory, that Jesus says, do this in memory of me. And so I think that gathering for a meal is a place to share memories and to be able to do that in a safe place. And as we share those memories, we also share dreams.
Thank you. Alan, any last
So, yeah, I mean, it's been said, it's not original thought with me, but that though the foundational meal in Christianity is in the upper room, that in a lot of contemporary churches, the real work goes on in the lower room, which is to say the church basement, which is a reference to, all the many churches that host 12-step programs, right? And that the grace of the things that John's just talked about, the grace of a place where you can tell your story, a place where you can be known, and a place where you can be accepted as you are, right? Is, it's happening. It's hopefully it's not an accident, actually, that most 12-step programs are hosted in churches. But that the lower room might actually provide a model for what we want church to be. I guess there's not a lot of bread there, but plenty of coffee. So, right. So in some way, sharing table, right, and sharing story with each other. So yeah, and the last thing I'd say, I'm sitting in Boston, so I'm not too far from Cheers, the bar of famous, 1980s fame, whereas the theme song said, you want to be where everybody knows your name. And though it may be a little bit trite, it's also profoundly true. And I think Building Bridges is providing an opportunity for folks to find such a place. So I'm grateful for that, and we welcome it, and we're grateful to Western Mass for beginning this program. We welcome opportunities to find them.
And so right back at you, our deep gratitude to the three of you for having shared so richly. And I will pass the torch on to Steve.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to all you folks who stuck around and witnessed this really hopeful talk. I feel some rays of light coming through here, and I really appreciate this. I get the question, what can we do to help? we were going to be reaching out to folks with a recording of this, which you can share with people you think might be interested, and ways to connect with us through our website, www.buildingbridgesveterans.org, and we can update you on what we're doing, keep you connected. You can seek our lunches out when we find the locations and maybe visit. And also, you can spread the word about what Building Bridges is, what we're doing. We really appreciate this, and we really want the initiative to become more familiar to folks as we try to reach out into other parts of the state to do this great work. So it's in the chat, our URL, and I will be reaching out to folks to follow up so that you can connect with us and you can share this video. And with that, we will finish. Thanks again to everybody, and God bless you all.